What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. Today, we're going to be going through the worst picks you can make in your 2025 fantasy football drafts. I'm going to be giving you guys reasoning for why I am avoiding these players at their current ADPs and maybe provide you with some other players you should be selecting instead. So if you haven't seen the video that we did earlier this week, we did do the best picks in each round. So this is the opposite of that version. Let's not waste any more time though. Let's hop right into today's video and let's start talking about these picks. All right, so let's kick it off here in round one. I am going to be going with Derrick Henry, running back for the Baltimore Ravens. Now, this is a player who's currently being drafted at the 110. And let's be honest, in the first round, there's really not bad selections. I don't think you can really mess it up too much, but I do have to pick somebody in this round, so Henry is my selection with that. Now, Henry's obviously coming off of a very stellar 2024 season, combining for over 2,000 scrimmage yards, and he had 18 total touchdowns with the Baltimore Ravens. He's a player that averaged 19.2 fantasy points per game in wins for the Baltimore Ravens, but he also averaged 9.8 fantasy points per game in losses. So there is a big discrepancy there for Derrick Henry, and that is the point that I'm going to try and drive home here. This is also a player that's turning 32 years old this season. It'll be a little bit later in the year, but still 32 for running backs is very, very dangerous territory, even if Derrick Henry has been a robot, cyborg type of running back over the last couple of years. The reality is 32, once that age hits, it's going to hit and he's going to be at higher risk for injury. But as another point to the argument against Henry, there are some better running back selections obviously in this round. If you're going to take the first round running back, getting a guy like Bijan Robinson, Saquon Barkley, Jahmyr Gibbs, I think all of those players are better selections than if you're not grabbing one of those. I don't mind taking one of the wide receivers. In Chase, Jefferson, CD, Puka, any of these names, I think all of them are great selections. So Derrick Henry is the worst selection in round one, even if I do think he is a great player. Now let's move on to the second round, and I am going to have the worst selection as Brock Bowers, tight end for the Las Vegas Raiders. He's currently coming off the board at about the 204, and this is also a player that dominated as a rookie last year for the Raiders. He set the rookie tight end record with 112 receptions, and he finished as the tight end 1 overall. Now, obviously, he's still going to be the clear-cut number 1 option for the Las Vegas Raiders, and he probably did get a quarterback upgrade in Geno Smith. However, my main issue with Brock Bowers as a selection is not necessarily the player or anything that Brock Bowers has done. It is more so the fact that you have to spend premium draft capital on the tight end position, and I just don't think that is sound strategy for fantasy football drafts. I am definitely somebody who would be fading the early round tight ends, going with that meat and potatoes of your lineup in the running backs and the wide receiver positions. I think those positions are much more important to your fantasy football roster and finding success in those fantasy football drafts. So as good of a player as Brock Bowers is, it is bad positional value to draft tight end early, and so I'm going to be fading Brock Bowers at his current ADP. Moving on to the third round, I do think Tyreek Hill is the worst selection in the third. Obviously the wide receiver for the Miami Dolphins. He's coming off the board at about the 305, and last year he posted career lows in yards per route run at 1.75 and career lows in yards after the catch. So wasn't a great year for Tyreek Hill. Obviously he dealt with some things last year where he was a little bit older, had a wrist injury during the season, and he spent some months of the fantasy football season without Tua Tagovailoa at the quarterback position. Now, this is also a player who only averaged 12.1 fantasy points per game, basically from weeks 8 to 16. At the end of the day, I think you have to make the decision on whether or not Tyreek Hill is falling off or whether Tyreek Hill is actually still an elite option. I just think in this tier, there are still better, safer options that you can select than Tyreek Hill, like Garrett Wilson and Jackson Smith and Jigba, and so I'll be avoiding Tyreek Hill in my drafts at this cost. Now, in round 4, by far the worst selection is Joe Mixon, running back for the Houston Texans. His ADP is currently at the 410, and it's likely going to drop over the next couple of weeks. So if you're drafting right now, by far the worst pick in the round. But this is also a player that averaged 23.3 fantasy points per game through week 11 of last year, but then he fell off hard and only averaged 6 fantasy points per game in the final month of the season. He ranked 38th overall in missed tackle rate and 41st in zone run success rate last year, just further proving that he lost a lot of the efficiency down the stretch for the Texans, and he's currently dealing with a foot injury and is probably going to miss some time here. He is supposed to miss at least the majority of training camp, and it is to be determined really at this point whether or not he's going to be there week 1. So Nick Chubb, Woody Marks, those are going to be the guys that you are going to be looking at for the Houston Texans. Joe Mixon, for me, probably going to be a guy that is virtually off the draft board at this point in time unless he gets a very, very massive ADP dip, or this is a player that we get some very good news on here in just a couple of weeks, but I am not drafting Joe Mixon at this current cost. Round 5, I think the worst selection in here is going to be Sam LaPorta for the Detroit Lions. Obviously, this is kind of a similar thought process to Brock Bowers. LaPorta's coming off of the board here at the 504, and this is also a player that just a year ago regressed from the tight end 1 to the tight end 7 after having a dominant rookie season. Now, obviously, we're seeing similarities to that with Brock Bowers, but this is also a player that's in a very crowded offense here in Detroit. He has to share touches with Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jahmyr Gibbs, David Montgomery, Jameson Williams. Lots of mouths to feed here in Detroit, and they just lost their offensive coordinator. I think the mid-round tight end is probably not where you want to be spending that draft capital for you on your fantasy football teams, so I think it's better, just like I said with Bowers, load up on those running backs and those wide receivers and grab a late-round tight end dart throw instead. Guys like Evan Engram, Tucker Kraft, David Njoku. I think you can get similar production, maybe not exactly the same production as Sam LaPorta, but similar production at a much cheaper cost. So I'm fading Sam LaPorta at his ADP. Round 6, the worst selection for me is going to be Quinshon Judkins, running back for the Cleveland Browns. He's coming off of the board at the 606, and this is a very solid collegiate prospect that got good NFL draft capital, and he had 45 rushing touchdowns over his 3 college seasons there and led all of the rookie running backs in targets per route run. He was drafted in the early second, like I said, to a very run-heavy type of offense for the Cleveland Browns, but this is a player that is dealing with off-of-the-field issues for a domestic violence charge that he had come up. We don't really have a ton of information on it at this point in time, but the information that we do have is he hasn't signed his rookie contract with the Cleveland Browns, and there are massive red flags right now because he is missing very valuable training camp reps in a very muddy running back room that has Dylan Sampson, who is also a rookie in this class, and Jerome Ford, who we saw get touches at some points last year. So Quinshon Judkins, the off of the field issues are making him very risky, a red flag type of pick, and somebody I am definitely not willing to spend my draft pick on, because I think you can get other players like Pacheco, Aaron Jones, Tony Pollard, who may not be as exciting of a name as Quinshon Judkins, but are definitely going to outproduce him, especially if this continues to linger into the season where Judkins is missing time. Round 7, I think the worst selection in this round for me is going to be Baker Mayfield, and that's unfortunate because I'm a big fan of Baker Mayfield. I love rooting for him, but his current ADP of 703 is just a tiny bit high for me. This is a player who threw for 4,500 yards and 41 touchdowns last year with a 70% completion rate for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He led all quarterbacks with 8 top 5 weekly finishes last year, and he had a 7.2% touchdown rate, which screams regression is on the horizon here in 2025. I think he's very unlikely to repeat those numbers that he had last year for the Bucs, and I do think at this point in time there are better value options later in drafts like Kyler Murray, Dak Prescott, Jordan Love, maybe even Brock Purdy, where you can get similar production if Baker regresses and not be spending that 7th round pick on a quarterback. Moving on to round 8, the worst selection is going to be Brandon Aiyuk, the wide receiver for the San Francisco 49ers. His current ADP is the 809 in drafts, and this is a player who only cleared 50 yards once in 7 games last year for the 49ers before tearing his ACL in that season. Now, with that said, this is also a guy who only had 1 game with 8 fantasy points or more last year, and he is recovering from that MCL tear plus the meniscus plus some of the other damage that he had in that knee, and he's probably going to be starting the season here on the PUP, which is the physically unable to perform list. When you have injuries like this and guys start the year on the PUP, you definitely have a production delay from those players. So I do think this is a player that maybe later in the year, the back half of the season, he does kind of bounce back to form, but that's too late for me to be spending draft capital on him in my 2025 drafts. And this is more so a player that I'm probably just going to be looking at in 2026 and beyond and fading him in 2025. Moving on to round 9, I think the worst selection in this round is running back Rhamondre Stevenson for the New England Patriots. He's coming off the board at the 909, and last year had a horrible season for the Patriots. He averaged just 3.87 yards per carry and followed that up with some very bad efficiency in the receiving game as well, where he was averaging just 0.66 yards per route run. So the Patriots, they went out, they added another running back, one of my favorite running backs in this year's draft class in Trevion Henderson, and I think he has a ton of juice and is going to be a real weapon for this Patriots offense. So he gets the added competition. He's not explosive, he's not efficient, and now he has to compete for touches. It's not a recipe that I want to be investing in those drafts. And if you have to make a selection for a running back that's going to be in a committee for the majority of the year, there are much cheaper options with similar upside to Rhamondre Stevenson like Tajay Spears, Rashad White, and J.K. Dobbins, who I think all are an injury away from seeing some massive touches. And I think that's the same thing with Rhamondre Stevenson, but TreVeyon Henderson's going to take all of his lunch money, especially in the receiving game in those PPR leagues. And if I'm taking the running back later, I'll just take some of those other handcuffs that I think have some upside instead of Rhamondre in the 9th. And now getting into the 10th round, I think the worst selection in this round is going to be Keon Coleman, wide receiver for the Buffalo Bills. He's currently at the 10-10, but last year as a rookie, he only had 3 weeks where he was a top 36 or better wide receiver, and he was used very heavily in a rotation last year where he was on and off of the football field, and it was very inconsistent in terms of how often Keon Coleman was actually on the football field. Now, overall, he had fine metrics. I would say they were good, not great, averaging 1.55 yards per route run, 7.1 yards after the catch per reception, but those aren't game-breaking numbers. Those are pretty middle of the pack type of numbers from a player that some thought were pretty talented going into a good situation here with the Buffalo Bills. Now, the problem is the Bills, they went out and they paid Joshua Palmer, and whether I believe Joshua Palmer is actually super talented, I don't. I just think it's a little bit worrisome that they decided they needed to add more wide receiver talent into this room, and maybe part of that is because they were disappointed in what Coleman did as a rookie. Keon Coleman's going to be a very volatile, risky type of pick in the 10th round, and I think there's players around him that have better ceilings and higher floors when you're looking at taking that type of risk. If you're going to pick a player like Keon Coleman, I think you're better off taking a guy like Jaden Higgins, Emeka Egbuka, or even Tucker Kraft if you're punting the tight end position like I think you should, to get some upside in other places that probably has higher floors as well. So there you have it. That is 10 players that I think are the worst picks in each of their respective rounds. Obviously, like I said, we did the best picks in each round version of this video earlier last week, so make sure you guys go check that out for me if you liked this video. If you liked it as well, make sure you hit the like button, make sure you hit the subscribe button, and make sure you go join our free Discord. We'd love to have you around this community long term for the majority of the 2025 season, trying to help you guys win those fantasy football championships. But with all of that out of the way, I have nothing else for you guys today, so I will see you on our next episode. But until then, peace out.